Good morning. I think all of us know what a compound word is, right? You take two words and put them together and you make a new word, such as crosswalk, and that makes the word crosswalk, or skateboard, or earthquake. And, you know, those words like that, they kind of go together and you make a new, can make a new word. And there are some words that seem kind of strange that you take two of them and you put them together, you know, like black light. Black light, okay, or rap music. Okay, no offense to those of you who listen to rap music. But what happens if you take the word friend and enemy and put them together? Frenemy, okay, that's a frenemy. And did you know that it's actually, frenemy is an actual word? The Urban Dictionary defines it this way: someone who is both a friend and an enemy. A relationship that is both mutually beneficial or dependent while being competitive, fraught with risk and mistrust. In short, it is an enemy that is a friend. And there's actually a website out there devoted to frenemies. There's actually a movie called Frenemy. And when it comes to that sort of those sort of people, you may think of Batman and Catwoman, or Tom and Jerry, Will Schuester and Sue Sylvester, or The Odd Couple, or Grumpy Old Men, and the list goes on and on. You know, Business Week says that frenemies are common in the workplace, and maybe you have some that you deal with in your life as well. Now, did you know the Bible also has what you could call frenemies? Cain and Abel, Abram and Lot, Sarah and Hagar, Jacob and Laban, Joseph and his brothers. And what's interesting, when I was thinking about all these people that could be classified as frenemies, is that most of them were family. They were related to each other in some way. It's been said that the book of Genesis is all about dysfunctional families. And really all of us are kind of dysfunctional, right? Sin has affected all of us. But the frenemy issue is prominent at the end of Genesis in the story of Joseph. And so I want to look at that this morning and look at what the Bible says can guide us in dealing with these sorts of things. So if you would, turn to Genesis chapter 37. Genesis 37. Most people, when you hear of Joseph, a lot of people think of the Sunday school and Joseph and his coat of many colors. And there was a song that was popular years ago about Joseph and his coat of many colors. And that actually comes from the book of Genesis. So let's go ahead and read the book of Genesis, chapter 37. We'll start with verse 2. Okay, this is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending his flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made him an ornate robe for him. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf arose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." And when he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now I know that family rivalry is kind of a normal thing, but his brothers intensely disliked their brother Joseph. And it's easy to see why they went so far as to hate him. I mean, look what happened. Joseph, the youngest brother, tattled on all his older brothers, and of course, nobody likes them. But on top of that, Joseph, the tattletale, was Dad's favorite son, so much so that Dad made a special outfit for him. None of the other brothers got this special outfit, but everyone knew that Joseph was Dad's favorite, and Dad didn't seem to make any secret of it. And Joseph dreamed, on top of all that, Joseph dreamed that he was greater than all of his brothers. How do you think Jacob reacted to all of this? Now that you notice the way I read it, Jacob was kind of chuckling, and I kind of wonder if that's the way. Oh, it's kind of cute, that he really has all of these aspirations of greatness, and so after all, Joseph was his favorite son, and so and he obviously didn't react the same way that all the rest of his did. The text says that he kept it in mind. Now, have you ever felt overlooked, underappreciated? Felt like maybe you were treated like mud? Maybe in your workplace, maybe at your job, maybe even among your own family members. And maybe you see that there is a favorite, like the teacher's pet. Someone that can do no wrong, and no matter what you do, it seems like you can never measure up. And you know what? That doesn't even come close to what Joseph's brothers are feeling. And then comes the last straw. Let's go ahead and continue reading verse 12. Now his brothers had gone to graze flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, okay, that's Jacob. Jacob and Israel, different names for the same person. Israel said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them. Very well, he replied. So he said to him, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. And then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. Okay, so it seems like maybe Jacob kind of contributed to some of the rivalry among the brothers. He sent the youngest one out to look after them and to come back and tattle on them. At least that's the way they would have seen it. So when Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around the fields and asked him, what are you looking for? He replied, I am looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks? They have moved on from here, the man said. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. Maybe they're supposed to be in Shechem and they're not supposed to be in Dothan. I don't know. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. Saw him in the distance, and before he reached him, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. When Reuben, that's the oldest brother, when Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him, Reuben said. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and to take him back to his father. I kind of wish I could have been there to see exactly what was happening. Sometimes I wonder if all of this, they're talking about this, and maybe Reuben was thinking, oh, they're not real serious, because sometimes people fantasize about something bad happening to someone they don't like. And then he discovers, oh, they're not kidding after all. Kill him. Let's throw him down into this dry well. And he intended to rescue him later. And so when Joseph came to his brothers, verse 23, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. And the cistern was empty, and there was no water in it. And as they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. And Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. Okay, this seems like a good thing, right? We're not going. This isn't so bad. He's our brother. We won't kill him. We'll just sell him off into slavery down into Egypt. And so they bought him and they took him away. And what are they going to? Gone. And of course, you know what happens next. They said, well, they still had his robe. Let's tear it up, put some blood on it, and tell Dad that a wild animal has eaten him. And when they told their father, he wept. He was heartbroken, and as they tried over and over and over again to console him, but he was inconsolable. Can you imagine their reaction after all of this happened? And their father is brokenhearted. He's weeping. I kind of wonder what was going through their mind at that point. There was nothing they could do in order to calm him down, to console him. In fact, later in his life, Jacob will look back on his life and has said his life has been nothing but trouble and sorrow. And this just is another thing added to all the trouble and sorrow he had in his life. You know, they tried to elevate their own status by knocking Joseph down, but it seems like now it's backfired as they watched their father weeping and being inconsolable. They wronged their brother and they broke their father's heart. And you know, that's the nature of resentment. That's the nature of competitiveness and hate. It can feel so good when you act on it. And I'm sure Joseph's brothers were probably laughing. It felt gleeful. It felt really good to take it out on Joseph. But the aftermath is always dark and gloomy and cold. And when all of that exhilaration dissipates, it's like a fast burn. All you're left with after that fast burn is ashes. This reminds us that hate directed at the wrong thing can be destructive and corrosive. And the reason I say hate directed at the wrong things, there are some things we need to hate, right? Not people, but there are some things we need to hate. Hebrews chapter 1 verse 9, talking about Jesus, says, "You have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness." You have hated wickedness. Our Lord Jesus hated, but He hated the right thing. He hated sin, He hated wickedness, but He didn't hate people. He loved people. That's why the Bible says in John 3:16, "For God so loved the world," and what He meant by the world is us. What He meant by the world is people. God so loved people that He gave His only Son for us. 1 John 4:8 says that God is love. And this is why Jesus says to love even your enemies in Matthew chapter 5. So Jesus hated wickedness, but He loved people, even His enemies. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 15 says that everyone who hates his brother or his sister is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. In other words, if I hate my brother or my sister, if I hate someone, that comes between me and God. And so that's pretty serious stuff. So what do we do with it? What should Joseph's brothers have done with it? When you've got hate and resentment in your heart towards someone, what do you do with it? You know, when we skip further into the story in Genesis, Joseph finally taking out his revenge. I mean, after all, his life, just one series of misfortunes after another after this. Actually, it depends on how you look at it, okay? Because when Joseph gets sold into slavery, it seems like every time things started to get better, he was knocked back down again. One thing after another, until he finally finds himself in prison. But in the end, Joseph winds up rescuing all of Egypt from a severe famine that was coming, and instructed the Pharaoh and everybody to stockpile for the coming famine, and he was actually put in charge of everything. He was second only to Pharaoh in the land. And while this is happening, while this famine's going on everywhere, and they're stockpiling all this grain, here's what's going on back home with among Jacob and his family. Let's go to chapter 42 of Genesis. Chapter 42 of Genesis. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you keep looking at each other?" He continued, "I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die." Then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But did not. Benjamin is the youngest, and Joseph's brother. He didn't send him with the others because he was afraid that harm might come to him. So Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for there was famine in the land of Canaan also. Now Joseph was governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. And so when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. You remember that dream that Joseph had? Okay, so they're bowing down to their brother. And as soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. Obviously, they didn't recognize Joseph. Joseph's all grown up and he's dressed like an Egyptian. So they didn't recognize Joseph. He pretended to be a stranger, and he spoke harshly to them. "Where have you come from?" he asked. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Can you imagine this moment? After all this time has passed, I wonder if Joseph ever dreamed that he would ever see his brothers again. And here they come. Can you imagine what's going through his mind as he recognizes them and see him coming in to him? They didn't recognize him. You know, Hollywood would make an action movie out of this, right? They would probably entitle it Joseph's Revenge or something like that, okay? Because that's what you do, right? And so Joseph, the story goes on, and Joseph kind of doesn't tell them. He accuses them of being spies, and you think that he might exact his revenge on them. Try to convince him over and over again, "We're not really spies, we're just people from the land of Canaan, and we're starving, and we just came here to buy grain." And he keeps questioning them, "Where are you from?" They told him about their father. "We have an old man that lives back home, our old-aged father, and we have a younger brother, and we had another brother, but he's not around anymore." And so Joseph had a plan to verify their truthfulness. And he said, "I'm going to keep one of you here. You go back and you get that youngest brother that's still living at home and bring him back, and then I'll verify whether you're telling the truth or not." Oh, Benjamin, the youngest son, who apparently now is Dad's new favorite. What are we going to do? We can't do that. And they began to argue amongst themselves, speaking in Hebrew. And of course, they didn't know Joseph was a brother and didn't know that Joseph could understand what they were saying. They thought he was just another Egyptian. But they began to argue and said, "Oh, this is happening because we're getting payback for what we did to Joseph." And so Joseph kept Simeon, sent them back home, gave them their money back. And so they went back home and told Dad what had happened. And Dad said, "Never. You're not. Benjamin is the only son that I've got left." What he meant, he's the only son that I have from that particular wife, Joseph's brother. But what about Simeon, who's still sitting in prison in Egypt? That's his son too. So it's obvious that Benjamin is his new favorite. And so they lived on the food that they brought back from Egypt. And after a while, they ran out. And Jacob says, "All right, boys, we're out of food. Why don't you go back to Egypt and get some more food?" And they said, "We can't go back there again, not without Benjamin. If we show up without Benjamin, he's going to think that we're spies, and there's no telling what he's going to do to us." And so, finally, after a lot of persuasive talking, they persuaded their father to allow them to bring back Benjamin. In fact, Judah said, if something happens to Benjamin, then I'll take responsibility for that. And when they came back, Joseph treated them, and he brought him into his own dining room, and he just lavished Egyptian hospitality on them. And they loaded up their grain, and as they were going away, they stopped for the night, and they noticed all the money once again had been returned in their bags, and also, well, they didn't know this yet, the king's personal favorite silver cup was put into their bags as well. Joseph had them put it in that without their knowing, and so he sent some of his men after them. Joseph did, and they said, "What have you done? We showed you all this hospitality, and now you're stealing from the king?" They said, "No, it's not. Check all of our bags and see." And they found the king's favorite silver cup in Benjamin's sack. And they said, "We're taking him back with us." And they said, No, take one of us instead. If Benjamin doesn't come back, our father is going to die from a broken heart." Intercedes, and they all wind up going back. And finally, as they're standing before Joseph, Joseph is overcome with emotion. He couldn't hold it back any longer, and he finally tells them, I am Joseph, your brother. That's another one of those Hollywood moments. Can you imagine the looks on their faces when Joseph, it's me, guys. I am your brother Joseph. And you know what happens next, right? Joseph runs over them with a chariot. And that's what happened in Hollywood, right? That's not what happened. But that's what would happen. I mean, that's what you would expect would happen. But that's not what Joseph does. Go to chapter 45, Genesis. Joseph said to his brothers, verse 3, is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. They knew what they deserved. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. And when they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Let me read that again. It was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. In other words, if Joseph had never showed up in Egypt, everybody everywhere would be starving from this famine. And Joseph recognized the chain of events that brought him to that place, that rescued his family from starvation, as well as a whole bunch of other people. Joseph could have held on to hate and resentment, and he could have retaliated at that point, but he doesn't. Instead, what he goes on to do, he invites his brothers and his father and his whole family to come and live in the land of Egypt because there's plenty here. And so they lived out the rest of their lives in Egypt. When Jacob finally shows up, he sees Joseph, the son that he thought he had lost. He says, I'm ready to die, but he's so happy he lived many years later. And that Joseph's forgiveness was genuine. It wasn't just for the sake of his father. Because you see, when he died, or Jacob died, his father died, his brothers all of a sudden were concerned because they said, oh, the only reason he was keeping us alive was because if he did away with us, that Dad would be heartbroken. And so when Dad died, they pleaded with Joseph and said, we're your slaves. Please spare us. Please spare our families. Please spare our sons. And here's what Joseph said. Chapter 50, verse 19. Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended harm. You intended harm for me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Can you imagine how the story might have been different had Joseph reacted the way many other people would have, getting his revenge, killing off his brothers, maybe throwing them in the prison for the rest of their lives? Instead, the story, this winds up being that demonstrates the goodness and the power of forgiveness. The fires of hatred could have consumed Joseph's life and would have left nothing but ashes. But instead, there was life, there was joy, there was peace, and this winds up being a very positive story in the end. You know, the only thing that can extinguish the fires of hate and bitterness is forgiveness. The only thing that can extinguish the fires of hate and bitterness is forgiveness. Years ago, I knew a young lady named Valerie. She was very close to her mother. And, to make a long story short, her mother got really sick and wound up in the hospital, and was in the hospital for a long time. And it looked like that she was never going to get out of the hospital. And I remember her siblings showing up, and then I remember her dad, her biological dad, showing up. Now, her mom and her biological dad had been separated many, many years. And it had something that, I don't know everything that happened, but I know it was really bad between her mother and her dad and the kids. He was a very angry, abusive person. And when he showed up, the reaction of everyone in the family is, what is he doing here? After all these years, he has the gall to show up here now. So there was a lot of emotions that were flying around in the room at that time. And Valerie came to me. She said, I don't know what to do with this. She said, I know Jesus says I need to forgive. And if I don't forgive, then God's not going to forgive me. How do I forgive that man for everything that he did to our family? And so we talked about taking small steps, one thing at a time. And part of it involved just saying the words, which she did. She said it took a lot of courage to say the words. And she began reaching out to her father. And she was, to my knowledge, she was the only sibling. Well, her youngest brother did too, but other than that, she was the only sibling that did. And her mother passed away, and I remember what happened next was remarkable. Somehow she managed to start building a relationship with this man. She's the only one that did. I remember at the funeral at her mother, you could see the looks on their faces because he was there, and they were just gasped that he had anything to do with any of them. And then when she went back to her father, I'm trying to get all the events in order here, she wound up spending time with him when he went into the nursing home, and she said, he's just an old, sorry man. I can't hold this resentment. She got to the point where it was easy to let go of all those resentments, even though years had gone by. And they wound up becoming very close. And he had another year after that funeral, and I remember he passed away. And I remember she wrote a poem to be read at his funeral, and I don't remember the exact words, but it was something along the lines of how thankful she was, even though all those years they could have had as a father and daughter were robbed from them, how blessed she was to have that last year together. And all of her siblings were at that. I remember their reaction was the same thing. They did show up to his funeral too, but they're shaking their head, still hanging on to that resentment. See, all of that could have just been just left ashes, but out of the ashes, because of the strength that she found in the Lord to forgive and to move on beyond it, something beautiful came out of that. The only thing, and she changed. I remember, and Stacy remembers this too, this used to be, when I first met this woman, she was probably all of about 300 pounds. And after she found the strength to forgive her father, it kind of made you wonder where all of that came from, because she became a completely different person. Her disposition changed. She became happier. She was more at peace. She was very emotionally well-adjusted. And she lost all of those, not all the 300 pounds, but all what she wasn't supposed to have. And you wouldn't even recognize her a year and a half later. You wouldn't even recognize that she was the same person. Not just the way she looked, but her disposition. And it's just a demonstration of the power of forgiveness. And how when you hang on to something and you don't let it go, what it can do to consume you. And in her case, when she let it go, she became a completely different person. The only way to extinguish fires of hate and resentment is forgiveness. Consider the words of Jesus while he was hanging on the cross. You remember what he said, right? None of those people there that put him on the cross did it. But he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So Jesus isn't asking us to do anything he didn't do himself, right? And if he can do it, surely we can do it as well. He died on the cross to procure forgiveness for us. And the only thing that stands between us and God is when we hang on to those things. We need to let our sin go. We need to let all of that go, because Jesus has paid the cost for those things. We don't need to hang on to resentment. We don't need to hang on to bitterness, because you know what? God says he's going to make everything right. It's not up to us to make everything right in the world. I mean, we try to do what we can in our little circle of influence, but ultimately it's going to be God that makes everything right in the world. And I am so thankful that he's offered us forgiveness and a way back to God. And if you accept that Jesus died on the cross for your sin, and that he rose up from the grave, and you're ready to let him rule your life, then you're ready to go down to the water, and to be born again. And if you've already done that, remember, we are to be a compassionate, gracious people, full of and willing to forgive. We're going to go ahead and sing a song, and if you need to respond, please come as we stand and sing.